Howdy, critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV gamers. So after a grueling 2.5 months or so, I finally did it. I cleared the Dragonsong's Reprise Ultimate Raid in Final Fantasy XIV. It's also just the first Ultimate I've cleared or even attempted, and it's almost universally agreed to be the most challenging encounter in the whole game. To say that it ranks among my highest gaming accomplishments wouldn't be too much of a stretch. Not that my list of lifetime gaming accolades is too much to boast about to begin with. Although, not to toot my own horn too much, but I did 100% Kirby Squeak Squad on the Nintendo DS, so you know, kinda cool. Anyways, raiding in Final Fantasy has been a real treat. Super rewarding, and not just the gameplay, but the community aspect has made the whole experience an overall positive one, despite the many hardships endured along the way. Watching the World Prog streams, talking about strategies with my static, and comparing notes with my friends from other statics. Everything both in and out of the game has made DSR a treasured gaming moment in my life. Well, with the amount of effort invested into it, it just seemed right to cap it all off with a discussion video of sorts. You know, stuff like documenting my takeaways and impressions, things I wish I had known prior, and yes, all of the horror stories that came with it. As you might be aware, DSR has garnered a bit of a reputation for being a static buster, with its almost unprecedented levels of intensity. That's the sort of thing you always hear about, but I always figured that kind of thing only happened to other people, you know? I started progging the raid with my static that I did Asphodelos with, a group which I joined about a month into the tier, and it was also just kind of my first experience with raiding in a pre-made group. Everyone else was a strong and seasoned player with plenty of Savage and Ultimate experience, so going into the fight I was feeling pretty confident. After all, it was just another raid. How much harder could an Ultimate possibly be to me, a Savage 99 parser? Of course, as I would soon find out, I was probably woefully unprepared for Dragonsong Reprise initially. In particular, I remember struggling quite a bit with the precise positioning and movement required in the first Thordan phase. In hindsight, it seems like a bit of a silly thing to wipe to so many times, but it really was just a big step up from anything I've done so far. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I did probably cost the group a not insignificant amount of time loss due to all of my personal wipes. Well, anyways, we did eventually get past Thordan and into Nidhogg, which, as I have heard from other people, is the first major real prog wall that many groups run into. This was about where my first group met its untimely demise, less than a month into prog, which, to be fair, was already pretty behind schedule. This really ties into the first lesson I wish I had known, and that was to make sure everyone's goals are aligned. I mean, that seems extremely obvious, but almost immediately after the first week or so of prog, it was pretty clear how much everyone was not on the same page, even if nobody really wanted to bring up that awkward discussion. Through various real-life scheduling conflicts, the slow prog and even deprog days, and just some members wanting to get ahead while others were more along for the ride, it was clear that things were unfortunately not going to work out. Got to the point where there were even doubts about meeting the initial vague and already relatively lenient goal of clearing before the next Savage tier release, a solid 4+ months or so after the fight released. But that kind of goes into the next thing I wish I'd known, which was simply the amount of time that went into prog. I did my damn best to not underestimate it, but I was only playing for about 3 or 4 hours a day for 3 times a week. And it just made me want to play more. I felt a little antsy when I wasn't raiding sometimes. It's already immensely difficult to line up the schedules of 8 individuals in different parts of the world with their own lives, so I get it, I do. But it did make me wish that I was able to find a way to put in more hours, other than trying to brave Party Finder, which had, let's say, diminishing returns in the value that it gave as I learned more and more of the fight. Your mileage may vary on the optimal time investment, but I do consider myself relatively immune to burnout. It's one of my toxic character traits. Who knows, it could be fun to try to world prog someday when I become stronger and go for like 12 hours or something at a time. On the topic of Party Finder though, even in hindsight, it's hard to say if I wish that I'd used it more during early prog. but it could have possibly saved some time on learning stuff like Sanctity of the Ward dodges. Some very unfortunate PF experiences sorta soured the whole process of using Party Finder for me, but it's just another tool that could have possibly been helpful, like the simulators that we use for later phases. I will say now though, in retrospect, the fight is pretty solidly PFable. There aren't a ton of mechanics that extensively rely on callouts or communication, I believe. But then again, I don't really have the best frame of reference for that. Anyways, the fight itself was pretty well designed, I think. It has a lot of spectacle, and it's really neat how it leans heavily into telling a story through the different phases of the fight. Unfortunately, I do think that the gameplay element of the fight design does take a bit of a hit in order to facilitate that storytelling aspect, but overall I do think that it's made worthwhile, as it's rather unique, and it definitely got a lot more people talking, even outside of the hardcore raiding scenes. Having a super challenging version of an old fight is cool for the people raiding, but the vast majority of players in FF14 will never even touch an ultimate raid in their life, so it doesn't really mean much to them. What they can appreciate, however, is the snippets of lore that are exclusive to the ultimate, a concept that hasn't really been explored too much in any of the other ultimates. Even the casual players who only play for the story and maybe do some fishing or triple triad on the side can marvel alongside everyone else as the world-first raiders find out just what happens in the hypothetical alternate timeline where Haurchefant manages to be saved, for instance. So just going one at a time in order, I'll give my thoughts on each of the 7 different phases to the fight. For this raid I played as a sage, although I don't think the role generally matters too much since all the players have to learn every part of most mechanics anyway. Although it was nice being able to use healer privilege to get out of certain mechanics like Mortal Vow passes. The first phase, or door boss I guess would be more accurate, is a pretty basic warm-up round. I've heard Attlefield and Grunow referred to as like bouncers at a nightclub, which I think is a pretty apt description. If you can't beat them in combat, then you can't get into where all the real action is. It's just dangerous enough to catch people off guard. Lord knows I've had my share of unfortunate incidents on the Attlefield Ashes when I was first progging it. And of course it does a great job of introducing new mechanics in a relatively low-stress environment to acclimate the player for when they show up in later, more intense situations. That's just like basic good game design 101. The PlayStation markers and chains in this phase are like the first Goomba in Super Mario 1-1. And then when they appear later in Death of the Heavens, it's like encountering a Goomba later in the game, but on a moving platform, over a pit of lava with rocks falling on you, or something like that. Anyways, the final thing I have to say about this phase is that I really appreciate how you don't actually have to properly execute the Charabert segment, as long as you can get them low enough to where Pure of Heart is survivable. Going completely contrary to that tangent about game design I went on earlier, the later instance of that mechanic showing up is arguably even easier than the initial one, since you'll have the tank limit break running and likely more resources and cooldowns saved up to mitigate the outgoing damage. As long as you remember to heal Haurchefant, of course, which might require more than one singular brain cell if you didn't bring Benediction for it. Save him, Smadge. The next phase, of course, is where the real fight starts. Phase 2, King Thordan. How many times do we gotta teach you this lesson, old man?
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I shall bury you on your release!
In general, I do try my very hardest to look at things from a more analytical and unbiased point of view, but damn, I really gotta admit, I'm pretty tired of this phase. Just because of how things work every Phase 5 and 6 prog day, heck, every even attempt to clear, is just Phase 2 prog in disguise. And while I do like the song they use here, it's not really one that works well as something to listen to on loop, as will tend to happen. Basically, it's no seeking a piece of reason, that's for damn sure.
Bitches be like.
And for something you have to do so many times, it's just so very slow and boring. My eyes kind of glaze over waiting for meteors to drop, or for towers to go off or whatever. But credit where it's due, as a healer I have plenty of time to click my one Square Enix allowed GCD cast with one hand while I use my other hand for a variety of other tasks, like checking Twitter, or replying to Discord messages. Heck, one time I overslept and missed lunch before raid, so I just pre-popped my mitts and ate a sandwich during the Ascalon's Might Cleaves. Despite all I said earlier though, I do think that if you were to look at all the phases in a vacuum, this phase might actually be one of the more difficult ones. Which feels weird to say since it's on autopilot pretty much just from the repetition, but if the order was swapped with Phase 5, for instance, I think that the entire raid as a whole would be overall more difficult. There's just so many small areas where something can go wrong and cause a wipe, not to mention the cursed meteor patterns, which took all the way until we were approaching the clear to get down somewhat consistently. Finally, there's the broad swings, the cherry on top. I do like that they added the loss of composure debuff as a bit of a lore shoutout, while also still managing to instill the fear of God of this attack, since nobody wants to be that guy that dies to broad swings. More interestingly though, broad swings presents a fun little simulation of the prisoner's dilemma in a way. See, you can use the vulnerability up debuff to pad your DPS and improve your parse, or you can hold DPS to allow your cooldowns to line up better for the next phase. If nobody or only a few people try to pad DPS here, then they'll reap the benefit, while also probably still getting a slow enough kill time to line up resources and mitigations. But if everyone tries to pad DPS, he'll die way too fast, which could result in a net loss of DPS, and also probably mess up cooldowns going into the next phase. Just something neat to think about for when people start stealth parsing here, if it hasn't already happened. Finally, we're at Nidhogg, or Nidstinian as it's affectionately referred to. As we leave Azazlaw behind and the skies fill with purple, my ears begin to perk up and the fog dissipates from my brain. Phase 3 might be one of, if not the single most fun phase in the whole encounter, mechanically at least. Even though it comes relatively early on, I never really got tired of doing the wormhole dance. Dive from Grace is a really well implemented mechanic that's dynamic, so it keeps you on your toes while also being very satisfying to pull off successfully. Although I will say that some patterns in particular are disproportionately brutal. I'm looking at you, second in line with Mirage Dive on Nash and Lash. Not only is the Dive from Grace part of this phase snappy and fast-paced, but it also gets bonus points from me for being a full uptime phase, which pleases my parse-rotted brain, as I attempt to resolve the movement while keeping my GCD rolling and also getting my proper mitigation up. Well, it seems they ran out of budget or ideas for interesting gameplay design in the first half of this phase, because after the first Dragonlance goes off, it's just a matter of counting from 1 to 4, and then just kinda wailing on the stationary boss to death all the way from like 40% HP. Now I don't think Dragonlance Prog is a combination of words that should ever exist in this context, but I'm ashamed to admit that more than one run in my original static was wiped specifically to Dragonlances. And yeah, suddenly the course of history feels a bit more understandable. Well, after that extended stretch of doing basically nothing, we're treated to another pause in the action as we wait for the eyes of Nidhogg to appear. Now, to its credit, the Nidhogg eyes scene at the end of the Final Steps of Faith is just one of my favorite cutscenes in the entire Final Fantasy XIV main story quest, even to this day. So having an entirely unique phase based on it, crafted basically from scratch for DSR, was a really cool lore tie-in. Again, however, it does kind of drag the pacing of the fight down due to how basic the Eyes phase is. It feels like the developers didn't want to quite commit to making it a fully involved phase, but it's just enough to be more than an intermission, so it still counts as one. It's not completely free, but most of the deaths here I'd imagine come from some tether pass jank, more than anything else. All in all, I think conceptually it's really cool and overall definitely worth having included. I'm not sure if there was a way to make it flow better in the fight progression though, since it's just sort of contributing to a vast stretch of nothingness in the middle of the encounter. Also, shout out to naming the eyes left eye and right eye and then starting the party facing them so they're mirrored. That definitely caused callouts to mess people up at least a few times. Also, does anyone else ever get worried that they're gonna screw up their tether pass because Alphonso appears in the corner of your peripheral vision and you think he's another player? Is it just me? Because that scares me for a split second like every time, I swear. Well, then we get to Intermission, which people have collectively agreed to not count as a phase, not even referring to it as 4.5 or something. Since it is pretty much a copy of the mechanic from the door boss, there isn't really a lot to mention here, although it is the prime culprit of sacrificing gameplay for the sake of doing something cool with lore. I think it wouldn't be so egregious if it wasn't causing such a big lull in activity, like from Nidhogg Dragonlance all the way to when stuff starts happening in Phase 5 Thordan. There isn't really a lot going on, and that's like, what, 4 whole solid minutes or so? I really don't want to just completely write off Ai's phase like that, but I do have to admit that with the level of gameplay expected for this fight, it does almost kind of necessitate that Ai's be made somewhat trivial. After that, though, we're moving on to the big boy leagues. From here on out, it's all gas and no brakes. Well, there are a few moments of reprieve during Thornton II, Phase 5. Dark Thordan, as some call it for some reason, even if I don't think he looks particularly more dark than usual. This is another set of trios like Thordan 1, but I do find it to be at least a bit more engaging. It might be because I have less fatigue for this phase, or because it's relatively late into the fight and I'm more alert for it, but the mechanics are probably at least slightly more interesting. Wrath of the Heavens is pretty basic, but I do kind of like the randomness aspect from the big grab bag of effects that can target any player. You never really know what you're going to get, and it can be sort of funny when one person happens to randomly get like 3 or 4 mechanics placed on them that they have to resolve all at once. It doesn't really add too much to the difficulty of it, since the solution is pretty much play the same every time, but it's something, I suppose. I've heard people kind of freaking out about twisters back in the super early days of this fight, but I never played UCOB, so I didn't see what the big deal was. Granted, I did immediately die to my twister the first time I reached this phase. Death of the Heavens was another big mechanic that was frequently regarded as a big prog wall, but thankfully we managed to solve it in a day thanks to the simulators that were available by the time we reached it. It's not an add-on to the actual game, so it should be safe to talk about it, surely. An hour of sim practice is worth days of prog, as they say. Anyways, just because of knockback angles being finicky in this game, it still is a mechanic that we saw a lot of deaths to. I think my favorite aspect of this is the spectacle of the phase. I'm a really big fan of when the stuff going on in the game syncs up with the BGM, and the mechanics in this fight are timed perfectly to the Heavensward theme, with the main motif kicking off Death of the Heavens, and the lyrics punctuating the quakes from Greneau. It really takes advantage of the scripted nature of the Ultimate design, and I am here for it. All in all, a solid phase. Probably more interesting mechanics than Thordan 1, despite the similar form factor. Having to spare him at the end is pretty goofy, but thankfully I haven't lost any runs to quote-unquote accidentally killing him so far. Next up, Phase 6, Bressfelder Nidhogg, Double Dragons as it's sometimes called. It's relatively controversial from what I've seen. I've heard it referred to as a choke check, where the mechanics aren't too complicated on their own, but the nature of it being both extremely punishing and very late into the fight can lead to a bad case of the shakies. I definitely feel it, as I've seen a lot of wipes to silly things like the hot wing incident, or trying to find the exact brick to stand on for worm breath tethers. Well, once I was able to get the hang of this phase and I got past the punishing stuff like the Akafa health bar balancing and the instant wipe mechanics from Bressfelder, I do find this phase to be rather fun. It's another full uptime phase with lots of movement, although not as compact as Nidstinian. Wrath Flames is the only mechanic that I would say is actually somewhat difficult, but once you know where you're going, it also feels surprisingly lenient. Having the, what do they call it, Allegan Melon definitely helps a lot for this too. Or just, a Fizz range player who's really fast at assigning markers for the stacks. They probably have time to do that. I mentioned it earlier as well, but I also enjoy just not having to pay attention to the Mortal Vow debuff at all as a healer, other than knowing that it does occur so I can social distance myself away from the pass. It's like the one Square Enix granted instance of healer-specific privilege in this fight, so I'll enjoy it while I can, since the final phase is full-on no mercy for healers. From a lore standpoint, this one feels a little strange. I'm not really sure how the events of the new Dragonsong War led to Bressfelder being enslaved by Nidhogg, and what was stopping him from just doing that in the normal timeline to begin with. But I'm fairly sure it's just a case of the devs wanting a cool fight with both dragons and throwing in the lore callback to justify it. Well, I'm not complaining. It's executed well, and anything with Dragonsong playing as the BGM surely wins a few points for that alone. The final phase, of course, is Dragon King Thordan. So if Double Dragons was a choke check, this phase is like a guy running up to you with a megaphone and shouting in your ear to not choke. I've heard of this phase as being referred to as kind of a victory lap, as seems to be standard for most Ultimate final phases. But it feels strange for a victory lap to be so damn stressful. Well, I'm not doubting that mechanically it's pretty basic, it's just a matter of doing the in and out and then pressing the proper mitigation buttons. But you best believe the first few times I reached this phase, I spilled an entire Olive Garden's worth of spaghetti on my buttons, dropping Caracal to reduce damage when nothing was happening, or throwing down Prognosis shields when they were already applied. Of course, once the initial shock value has passed and cooler heads prevail, it should be pretty basic to complete. The movement on Nexaflare, I guess, is a little tight, but since it's the same movement for the Brain Dead strat every time, it's not too difficult to execute consistently. I will say that the Enrage is a little lame after Perfect Alexander put everyone in time jail. Just having Piss Akmorn towers is a little underwhelming by comparison, but it's just a minor gripe. I was also a little unsure about having Revenge twofold as the BGM for this phase, since even if it is the orchestrated version, it still is just a dungeon boss theme. But hearing it in-game sync to the sound of the mechanics exploding in the background, I think it really does work. It sounds just so triumphant, which is the perfect mood for that final push. Anyways, once that's all wrapped up, the final thing left to do is turn in the totem for a shiny new ultimate weapon. As this was my first ultimate weapon ever, I was quite excited, and of course I got the new Sage weapon. Admittedly, I was a little let down that they chose the small orbs model instead of the wings or the pendulums, but I do like how they kinda look like Gilgamesh from Fate's Gate of Babylon when they're deployed. Overall, the weapons are pretty good. I was really hoping for like a purple effect or something, kinda like Thordan's Ascalon, since the T and UCOB weapons are already sort of goldish, but the rune particles when deployed do look really nice, and the shiny metallic red accents look great on a lot of the weapons as well. I do hope that for Omega Ultimate or whatever the next one is, they give us a different color scheme for the weapons though, maybe green or something, I don't know. Anyways, this video has gone on for quite a while. I am prone to rambling, I admit, but what can I say, I just love raiding in Final Fantasy XIV Online. I'd love to hear your experiences and thoughts on this fight if you cleared, or are attempting to clear, or are even just interested.